at the mics. Everyone's, I guess, met me and Onkar by now. I think you've only met Jason if you were in one of the breakout sessions that he was in. So should I introduce you, or do you want to introduce yourself?
You can introduce yourself.
So Jason's a professor of philosophy at DePaul and has written numerous books, most, I guess, on cosmopolitanism, which you could ask him about if you like. He came to my attention when he wrote a wonderful article in Salon about Rand's influence on his life called Jamaican Gay, and Ayn Rand Made It Okay, or I'm Jamaican Gay?
Yeah, something like that.
And that was, I thought, just a really fantastic article, and since then I've been reading some of his other stuff and talking to him. And so he's the third member of our panel. Onkar, you know, and me, you've met yesterday. Elizabeth?
So, either intellectually on a personal level, what has been the most challenging of Ayn Rand's ideas for you personally? Either to comprehend and work through, or to integrate into your life and concretize, put into practice.
Do you want? Which order shall we go in? Do you want to start?
I can start. For me, and I think this is probably typical for people. Before I switched to philosophy, and I did my double major as an undergrad, philosophy and economics. I was in the sciences, math and sciences. And the whole issue of free will in philosophy, that was the issue that I really struggled with, thought a lot about, read a lot. I mean, Rand's view, but that it's a perennial issue in the history of philosophy, and it's a really important issue. And the typical science education that you get is to deny that free will could exist and that human beings do. And to think about that whole issue and what does science actually tell you, and what is the philosophical framework they're operating in, which is typically, I mean, in philosophy, it's materialism, so they don't really believe in consciousness even. So that whole issue, it took years for me to sort that issue out. And I find, like, talking to a lot of people who come from science or engineering background, that's an issue they struggle with a lot.
Wait, now I'm going to feel really unoriginal. Because if it's one that I struggled with that was important to me, free will is also the issue for me. There are other ones that I found difficult to get my head around and took a lot of time, but they weren't as important to me. And other ones that didn't feel difficult, but I spent just a lot of time thinking about it, and the theory of concepts falls into that camp. But where I felt a conflict, and I felt, no, this can't be right, but it has to be right, and putting together free will is the issue that's most like that for me, or has been.
I think the issue that I still struggle with philosophically and personally is the issue of benevolence in human life, and how not to conflate benevolence with altruism, which I agree with Rand's position that altruism is improper and is actually evil. But for me, I tend to be someone who has a visceral love of the human species. So most of my work has been devoted to talking about what it means to be a citizen of the world. And I find quite often that I am engaged in acts of charitable, benevolent acts of giving to people, and wanting to find a space in objectivism where there is more conversation on the virtue of goodwill towards one's fellow human being, extending the hand of benevolence and goodwill in charitable ways that need not result in sacrificing one's self-interest to those of others. And just briefly, the second issue is in terms of her aesthetic theory. I've grappled with how Rand can state that Atlas Shrugged is not a didactic novel. It's a brilliant, original novel, but it is the presentation of a comprehensive, coherent, full philosophic system, and with very, very long instructional speeches on how to live, and a full presentation in Galt's speech on every branch of philosophy that I'm acquainted with. And so I find it difficult to see how there is an element of didacticism in Atlas Shrugged, and I'm still trying to I read the book I reread most often of Rand is The Romantic Manifesto, to try to understand that.
Hello. So my question is, I know Ayn Rand says that life is the ultimate value, and then her philosophy kind of flows from that, and that the nature of man decides like what is valuable to us, kind of thing, in the sense that like if we step out on the street and get hit by a car, we'll die, kind of thing. And but how do you deal with the is ought problem? I was always taught that an is does not necessitate an ought, kind of thing. Does that make sense? Did that make sense?
Well, let me just say generally, the idea that if you're thinking of from David Hume, that you can't derive normative statements from descriptive statements, oughts from ises, that supposes, and Hume's whole argument rests on the idea that what you would have to have is some kind of deductive argument with all is premises and then ought conclusion. And I think there are a lot of philosophers now, in addition to Rand, who've recognized that that is not the only way in which some knowledge is based on others. Think of the way in which you form a scientific theory which has whole new concepts in it based on evidence, the evidence of which isn't given in terms of those concepts. And just to give another example of a philosopher who's interested in this kind of issue, has a different solution to it than Rand, but just to give you the sense that this isn't some unique question that only objectivists are concerned with, Elizabeth Anscombe has a discussion of this and relative levels of bruteness. So Rand's answer, I think, and then I'll stop and see if the others want to add on the details of it, has to do with thinking about where the concept of ought comes from in the first place, where the concept of values comes from. Because if you think that concepts are based on observation in some way, if concepts are based on knowledge about the world, we don't just come to the world with them, but we form them, then it has to be that there's a way to go from statements, observations, knowledge that doesn't yet include that concept to one that for the first time is going to have it. And if you think about that question, think about it much more generally than about values, and then think about how it applies to the concept ought and value. That's the kind of key into a solution. And then to look for where Rand does this, there's a part in Galt's speech, but also early in the essay, The Objectivist Ethics, where she talks about how the concept of value depends on life. So I'll stop there. One of you might want to talk about that argument.
In the courses that I teach on moral psychology, I think some of these recent writers in moral psychology have probably read Rand, because what many of them have stated is that the question as posed by Hume in the first place is a highly improper question. That is, it is a question that is directed at human beings, and they talk about the law of identity and the law of causality, and human beings by nature have to make certain choices to continue their existence. So therefore, the whole question of how you derive an ought from an is improper in the sense that an ought is already implied in the furtherance of human existence based on choices that result in values that enhances one's self-preservation. I can say more, but I'll stop here.
And I'll just say one thing about thinking of what Hume is asking. I think to really grapple with philosophical questions, it's important to pay attention to the psychological issues going on. There's a way, I think, in what Hume is asking is, does reality make me do stuff? Does it give me commands? Does it tell me, order me around? And I don't think so. And I can do there, and that comes from a very religious. The ought is it's a command that you must, thou shalt do this. And Rand rejects that. That's what ethics looks like, and that to say that you can get an ought from an is not reality gives you these commands, and you can somewhere uncover 10 commandments. And it is, if you want to live, then you have to do certain things, and that is a real and a realistic conception of obligation. It's not an imposition of some like external force on you, ordering you to do. And she has a very interesting essay on this in the book Philosophy Who Needs It, called Causality versus Duty. And to get her full view of the relation of is to ought, you need to read not just the lead essay of The Virtue of Selfishness, The Objectivist Ethics, but also that essay.
Okay, thank you.
Well, and if one other recommendation on that issue, this is more for pretty serious philosophy students, which you might be, in the first book put out by the Ayn Rand Society, which is something like Egoism, Virtue, and Meta-Ethics, anyway, those three words in one order or another, there's an essay by Darrell Wright called Reasoning About Ends that discusses Rand's view in connection with Hume and Kant and Moore and a few other different theorists, and I think brings out a lot of these points in some detail.
So, given the premises that rights and interpersonal ethics arise out of man's relationship to reality and not from command, and the other premise, I guess, that force is only used morally in self-defense or in punitive action against, aggression, do you think there's a role for a legislature, or even what we think of as politicians in a good or free society? Or do you think maybe that something more like judge-made law or common law is the best way you might see an objectivist society actually providing justice?
I mean, I definitely think there's a crucial role for the legislature to define law and to codify, even if it is that there's some law that is more like common law that develops and is made through decisions. So to codify it and for a person to know this is what the law is and this is what it would mean to follow it, this is what it would mean to break it, these would be the penalties and so on. For that to be knowable in advance that a person can act on, I think it's really important to have a legislature. The whole issue of a constitution and have the basic framework of the whole system defined. It's in effect legislatures and politicians who did that, who gave you the American Constitution. So I think it's enormously important to have it codified into law, not just tradition.
I agree.
Yeah, I think I have nothing to add.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm still wondering how to make decision between what you're good at or what you love. Because I feel like if you love something, it doesn't necessarily follow that you're really good at. Because like one of my friends loves singing, but he's not very talented. So what he's supposed to do? Because he wants to be a singer, and and also another question: what does it mean to say you're really good at something? So can you give more explanation? Thank you.
Good, very good question. Onkar, you had something to say about this the other night.
I definitely think that it's easy to fall into, when you ask, am I good at this, to have external standards, and would people approve of what I'm doing, respect what I'm doing? If that question has real meaning, it has to have personal meaning. It is, do I think I'm creating values in the field that I'm interested in going into? And for me, it's much more a question of, do I find the field interesting? And can I see that I can get to a point where, from my perspective, and it might not be that it's accepted in the world, that I'm creating value. So when I went into philosophy, it was clear to me I'm interested in it. I was not good at it. And when I first, in undergraduate school, I'm getting C's on my paper, and they deserve to be C's. But it was clear to me that I'm very interested in the subject, and I'm going to find out if I can get good at it. And it was possible that I didn't get good at it, but it was also, I knew very well, and in this case, I already knew that I had different views than what was in the mainstream in philosophy, that it had to be, do I think what I'm doing is actually advancing knowledge? Is it helpful to teach this to people, even if the outside world or in many departments and so on, it would be look like, what exactly are you doing? And why are you interested in Rand and so on? So that evaluation, I think, it's easy to be, it not be your standard. It has to be your standards for what is good, not the world. And then it's a question, if no one else finds value in what you're doing, you might have to do something else. But I'm much more driven about, do I think it's valuable to do? And if I'm right about that, I should be able to convince other people in some form.
I think that there are a couple of things to bear in mind here, and one of them is that every phenomenon that one pursues has its own objective currency by which you evaluate or appraise whether you're good at it or not. And Rand had this to say about literature, for example. She said the currency that one uses to evaluate a successful work of art cannot be, of course, if it makes money, but if it solves, for example, a literary problem, or it achieves, more so, in her case, achieves an ideal that she had set for herself. So I think one has to determine the currency, and I think they are not just based upon one's personal opinion, but they're sometimes quite objective. There are objective criteria that will determine whether or not you're a good lawyer or a good philosopher. And I think it's reconciling sometimes one's own criteria or criterion with the objective external ones that exist. And the second issue I want to say is probably it's not a good idea to create a false dichotomy between what you want and what you're good at, because I think that if there is something that brings vitality to your body and you feel a sense of aliveness and enthusiasm and exuberance for, but you're not good at it in particular, then there are many alternative ways in which to organize such goods within one's life. One doesn't have to pursue that thing that you like but you're not good at for a living. It can be a hobby. It can be something that you simply indulge in once in a while. So I think there's a vast continuum along which the things that we're good at and the things that we're like can take place in our lives, and to sort of make the mistake, to make the sort of binary, a false bifurcation that if I'm not good at it and I like it, then it's over. It has no role in my life. One can still continue to sing in the shower and experience a great sense of elation and joy that gives one a great deal of intellectual and spiritual ammunition to go into the world. But to pursue that as a career is something that's probably not advisable. So I think that vitality in your body, that sense of excitement, that sense of I can't wait to throw the covers off in the morning, that's a good indication.
Let me just add one thing, which is that what we choose for ourselves isn't just a job or a career. It's a whole life, and this is building on what Jason said, that's organized, that has lots of different things in it. You're singing in the shower, or maybe at the karaoke bar at the weekend, or maybe for your job. And this isn't to say the person shouldn't choose the singing career, but they should think about what life they want, and they should think about it realistically, including what their abilities are, what their trajectories for improvement are, what their abilities to convince other people are, and think, what would be my life? Maybe a life that I think I could achieve realistically best if I was to be a singer. Do I think I'm going to become like a rock star or something, or an opera star or something, or do I think I'll sing at a cabaret in the local nightclub or something? What is the goal that I think I can achieve in that? How does that fit in with the other things I want in my life? And then think of other alternative ways your life might be organized, where, say, you're a singer, but that's a hobby, or you have a band on the side, but you do, or whatever it is, and think about those different lives, how they fit together, and then think, which of these is a life that I would be happy with? And if none of them, what's, as Keith put it before, is there a door number 4 that I can find? What would it be? But don't just think as an isolated thing, what should my job be, without thinking about what the rest of my life will be and how it will fit into it.
Thank you so much.
So it's the whole life that you have to love, and the job is the centerpiece of it, but it's not everything.
Hi. You talked a little about your difference between benevolence and altruism. I think that's an important distinction to make. So do you think there would be any value in replacing our use of other words like sacrifice or self-sacrifice with another more accurate term that most of us here would actually affirm, like exchange, since what altruists are actually attempting to do is exchange their actions for some sort of moral superiority or an afterlife or something else that's probably unreal? I'm looking for ways to undermine altruists in casual conversation.
Probably my answer is yes and no, in the sense that I think I would agree with Rand that any self-respecting person should probably expurgate from his or her consciousness and psyche such destructive terms like sacrifice, self-immolation, that has no proper place in a person's psychological makeup. I think exchanges, I'm perfectly happy with exchange. My problem is that, this is again the trader principle, which I respect so deeply in objectivism, and think it's the only proper way in which human beings should, I think for the most part, deal with each other. But I was asking someone, an objectivist philosopher or scientist by the name of Wendy, I think she's sitting in the back, right, last night, about, when I get off the elevator and I smile at someone, does that person have to earn my smile? If I am gracious to someone, to my fellow human being in the world, and pay him or her a compliment, you look really nice today. Well, in today's PC world, you get, sexual harassment charges filed against you. But I make a sort of benevolent gesture. Does that person have to earn it, or is it just, again, to build on Rand's wonderful theme of goodwill? One of the things she loved about America, of course, is that she said men and women extend goodwill and benevolence towards each other. I'm really, and you can talk about this because you've written, I was reading your essay today about this, about the trader principle, rereading it. I'm just really, really struggling. This is the one aspect of objectivism that I struggle with. That is, if everything is reduced to a trader principle, what happens to the unearned forms of interactions between human beings that just seem to function? Here I'm going to use a really unobjectivist term, a kind of social lubrication. You go to a party and you say to someone, I love your this, or hi, how are you? Come and meet my friends. They haven't earned that. You're not trading anything necessarily. You're not getting anything from them, but just the look of appreciation on their face. And I think that makes the world a better place.
Can I just respond to that? I think what you're doing is offering an exchange for a social value. I think that you probably don't need to worry about that aspect of it, because I think that you are exchanging something. You're offering something, and they might not smile back, or they might not accept your compliment, but then you can, rescind your offer. I think it's okay.
But I wouldn't.
You could unsmile at that.
I wouldn't want to do that.
From that.
I just wouldn't want to do that. I would be comporting myself in a completely unpleasant way, which would be at odds with who I take myself to be.
Yeah, I don't think of those as a trade in that sense myself. I think trade comes in when there's something you want from other people. And the question is, how do you get it? You get it by offering them something in which they'll give it to you. And if you're thinking about a relationship over time, even if it's not thought of in that terms, I want this, how will I get it? You think that any relationship that's over time that's good and valuable, that's not toxic for your life, has a kind of give and take where each party's getting something. But if you're thinking about what happens with somebody who you don't in particular want anything from, who you're not thinking you're ever going to see again, that you just pass in the elevator, what I think you're doing when you smile at them or appreciate them is you're simply expressing a feeling of appreciation or smile that you have that's not really for this person in particular, since you don't know this person, but for human beings in general, and something about them that something in this person that reminds you of or puts you in mind of, or that captures this general feeling you have towards human beings. And in a way, that's a trade. You're offering the smile in exchange for the pleasant feeling you get from them. But it's not, that makes it sound a little bit more deliberate than it is. You're simply, if you see a bird that looks very pretty, you might smile at it, and it's not like the bird will chirp better or something for you. So that's how I look at those kinds of interactions.
Yeah.
Now, when you were laughing, that was because what do you want from us from that?
No, let me say on a different issue that was brought up in the question, that Rand viewed benevolence and altruism as opposites. So there's a tendency to think that they're synonyms or close synonyms, and she thought that's completely wrong. So benevolence is wishing, or you put it in terms of goodwill, that you wish others well, that you have a positive view that there are potential values in the world, who are pursuing their own goals. You're wishing them well for their sake. And altruism, the attitude it engenders you towards other people is, my life doesn't count, it really belongs to them. I'm supposed to serve them, I have some kind of duty towards other people. And it makes you suspicious and resentful of it. Other people now become a claim that all of a sudden they can say, no, I can get some of your money, or you have to volunteer to graduate high school, I get some of your time. Other people become a threat to you. And a society that really pushes altruism, it eliminates goodwill, because you don't have that kind, you don't wish others well. There are always potential threats who can claim, you don't know when, your values, your time, and your money. And she viewed America, you brought up that, as a country of goodwill, particularly because it was a country dedicated to the pursuit of each individual's own happiness. So he didn't have to view other people as a threat who might claim all of a sudden, no, you don't have a right to pursue your happiness. You're supposed to be pursuing mine.
I appreciate Dr. Hill's use of the term PC, and I just wanted to say my favorite principle is PC principle. So my understanding is there's more than one camp of objectivism, and I just wanted to see if the panel could iterate the differences and emphasize the implications of that.
Onkar, do you want to?
What are the camps that?
Well, my understanding was the Atlas Society had a different idea of objectivism, or maybe there isn't. Maybe I'm wrong. I wasn't sure if, I was just curious if there was some kind of split. In most big groups like Christianity, Judaism, anything like that, there's always some kind of inevitable divide. And I'm curious if there is one. My understanding is I think there is. If there is, are there differences and implications?
Yes. So I think it's called the Atlas Society now. It's gone through a whole bunch of names. But yes, that was a split from, you could say it was a split from the Ayn Rand Institute. So if we're just looking organizationally, the person who founded what's now the Atlas Society, his name is David Kelly, and he was before that affiliated with the Ayn Rand Institute, and he would speak for them. So it's a split in organizations, and it's true if you look in any kind of move. If you look at, say, at the Founding Fathers, we tend to think of the Founding Fathers as now one monolithic group, but there were all kinds of factions and feuding among the Founding Fathers. So if you're looking at it like that at a personal organizational level, yes, there's that kind of split, but I don't hold it as there's two now versions of objectivism or something like that. And what I think should have happened is, so you get these kinds of splits about viewpoints and about a whole philosophical system or a system of ideas. I think David Kelly had some profound disagreements with what is objectivism. Really is the name of Ayn Rand's philosophy. He had profound disagreements with some central ideas. And what he should have said is, I'm presenting a new philosophy. He could have even called it neo-objectivism or something like that. But what happened is he presented it as objectivism, when I think it was so clearly not. And to me, that's fraudulent. It's not, you've got now two different versions or something. He's simultaneously presenting it as though it's Ayn Rand's philosophy, when it's so clearly not, though it has elements of some of her ideas, but it's so clearly not her philosophy. So that's how I view that what happened, and so I don't hold it as there's two. That's why I asked about what you meant exactly about two versions of objectivism.
Do you want to say something about what the differentiating feature is?
Well, you can.
Well, okay, you're the one who put it that way. I think so that historically that split kind of came about over arguments about what kind of relationships to have with libertarian groups, and particularly the kind of libertarian groups that alliance that includes anarchism that I was talking about yesterday. But what happened as a result of conversations about what policy to have is a lot of differences came out over the extent to which ideas themselves can be good or evil. And I think it's a central part of Rand's philosophy that ideas can be morally evaluated. That's not exactly the same thing as evaluating the person who holds them, because there are cases in which somebody could confusingly hold, particularly young people, in a moral idea, but a lot of cases in which people should be evaluated for the ideas they hold, and advocate. So there were questions about that, and also questions about whether objectivism names the particular system of ideas that Rand developed, or whether it names a kind of broad framework where there could be many different versions of it. And Kelly took this view that there could be many different versions of it and he could tweak it and it was still the same thing, rather than saying, as I think he should have, the thing has a stable identity and I have a thing that's different from it with respect to what I think about judging ideas and whatever other points it might be. And I appreciate what I got from her, but there were some disagreements too. So that's what I think the kind of content of the differences are.
I don't really have that much to say because as an academic, I tend to just, and I've been teaching Rand for her ideas to my students for 20 years, I tend not to get caught up in these schisms. One of the understandings was that my understanding of the situation was whether objectivism was a closed system, as I think Leonard Peikoff thought it was, and David Kelly thought it was an open-ended system. And, I just have one particular, as a scholar, an academic, when I'm teaching Rand, is when in doubt, go to the original source. She was probably the clearest philosopher I have ever read. And there is no jargon, there is no mumble jumble, no obscurity in her work. It's crystal clear. And so that's how I deal with it.
Thank you.
Hi. In one of my classes, we've been looking a lot at cooperation.
Could you point the mic a little bit more at your mouth? It's a little hard to.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. In one of my classes, we've been looking a lot at cooperation and reciprocity. And we've looked at different studies, some agent-based modeling and some actually looking at different cultures. And there were a lot of cases in which the agents or the people chose to cooperate or to reciprocate, even when it wasn't directly in their best self-interest. So we looked at some prisoner dilemma type situations in which people didn't choose their dominant strategies. They chose sort of to work together, even though it didn't bring about necessarily like the highest return for them. Mm-hmm. How do we look at that through objectivist principles? Do we see it sort of as irrational? Can we explain it? Do we see it as something that's like driven by norms or by biology? What do you guys think about that?
Let me start by repeating something a professor told me once. We walked into a classroom, a philosophy class was about to start, and there had been a previous philosophy class on the board, and there was in the room, and there was a little matrix on the board that was clearly a prisoner dilemma dichotomy, and he kind of frowned at it. And I asked, are you frowning at this prisoner's dilemma? And he says, well, it's a kind of situation that only comes up when you're in prison. And now that's not exactly true, but there's, I think a lot of the situations that are brought up in these kinds of studies, prisoners' dilemmas and iterated prisoners' dilemmas, it's often thought that they're a lot more like a lot of normal life than they are. And first of all, there are no real stakes on you when you're in the game, so you're not actually making the choice. And two, they're very artificially constrained, even if there were real stakes on you, compared to the kinds of interactions you have in real life. So before saying anything more, just want to caution about the methodology of thinking we can study decisions and what people's motivations are through prisoners' dilemmas and other such studies. They might have some role, but I think people place a lot more emphasis on them than they deserve. I have some other things I could say about rationality and reciprocity, but I'd like to hear the other two panelists, so if you have any thoughts.
Well, probably a lot more information would be needed in order to make sense of a study like that, because I think quite often one can make certain strategic moves with a long-term goal in plan, with short-term failures built in as a necessary condition for getting to the long-term strategy. So I would be reluctant to just take at face value the idea that there was nothing to be gained by these exchanges. I mean, if there are smart, rational people involved in this kind of scenario, and I take them to be very smart and rational, then it's unlikely that anyone would work for his or her loss. Now, it can be that we all make, it's like a game of chess. You make strategic moves and you plan a counter move if you're a clever strategist, knowing that you can recoup the failures, the short-term failures and immediate loss for some long-term larger gain in the future. And so I think I agree with Greg. I would be very suspicious of how these studies get sort of extrapolated onto the social landscape or the social milieu, and we draw general, almost deductive conclusions from those studies that seem quite erroneous to me.
There's one other point. People legitimately and rightly value other people. We've talked about Jason smiling at the people in the elevator, but I think all of us do things like that, including in close personal relationships like love, but just values you might have of other people around you. We can talk about why that's rational and why valuing other people is self-interested and why other people doing well is to your interest generally. And that's a question that if we want to take up, I think we should take up outside of the context of responding to these artificial thought experiments. But once you recognize that that is rational, that it is self-interested and rationally self-interested to care about other people, specific other people, but also have general concern for other people, then it's not surprising that one of the things that people would weigh in their decision-making in a weird artificial situation where they have to decide whether to betray or cooperate with somebody is that they're overall on a premise of wanting to have goodwill, and that they would be willing to, in effect, pay some amount in some other currency to maintain that goodwill and fellow feeling and reciprocity. And so that they're not going to, they'll be slightly nicer and make 10 cents less or something shouldn't be any kind of shock. Having that kind of attitude towards other people is worth more than the 10 cents. Now, if, you get really certain kinds of effects might require explanation, but it shouldn't, you shouldn't think selfishness means, if selfishness means rational self-interest, one shouldn't think that means not giving a crap about anybody else or about having mutuality and reciprocity in your relationships. Ashley?
Hi, I think a premise at work in an earlier question was, can you try to challenge an altruist by claiming that everyone's really acting in their self-interest, right? Because you're just exchanging for the afterlife, or you're just, something of that nature. And I don't think that's correct, but I was wondering if you could just kind of comment on that idea that, well, no, in the end, we're all really acting on our self-interest. You think that your reward's in the afterlife or something, and and it's really not. But can you just speak to that?
Isn't everybody selfish?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
You were talking about this in your talk yesterday a bit.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to say about that kind of, if we're putting the question that general, isn't everybody selfish? But there's to take one aspect of it, there's a confusion between a person having a goal and that goal being to advance his self-interest or to pursue his happiness. But if we're putting it in moral terms, there's a difference between a person having a moral goal and the goal being that he thinks it's moral to pursue his own self-interest and his own happiness. And this was, I brought it up in regard because I get it almost every time if I'm in a classroom setting, if I bring up Mother Teresa, that first it's, we regard her as an ideal, and then you push, what the ideal means is you take a loss and it's to suffer, and that is what, it's self-sacrifice. Then they start to get uncomfortable, and then it's, but doesn't she really get satisfaction from doing it? And so, because now they don't want it to be that it's a loss or it's self-sacrifice. But there's a difference between saying, yes, she is pursuing a moral goal, but her goal is that my personal happiness doesn't count. I have to act like that. My goal is to serve others, and so on. So you can't then say, well, it's really self-interest or it's really the pursuit of happiness, because the goal is so actively not to do that. So, and the equivocation in that everyone's selfish is they're pursuing goals. Now, it's not even true that everyone at all times is pursuing a goal, but I think Mother Teresa was. She had a vision of what it means to be moral and how she should be acting, and she was pursuing that. But that goal is not the pursuit of her happiness, of her self-interest. So it's exactly wrong to say that what she's doing is really selfish.
me add that from the perspective of Rand's philosophy, that is the way she thinks of these issues, this question is connected to the question that Onkar and I each said at the beginning that we struggled the most with, which is understanding free will. Because if everybody really is always selfish, if everybody really is going toward what they think is the best thing for them, and there's no alternative to doing that, that's just how people act constantly all the time, then there isn't free will. And that issue of is there free will or not, and how does it relate to whether everybody's selfish, was a major issue that Rand herself thought a great deal about, and the whole last third of Atlas Shrugged is about that. Early towards the end of part one, Dagny thinks she has to rely on her brother Jim's self-interest for something. And then she thinks deeply, wait, is Jim motivated by self-interest? And she kind of puts the thought aside. But the question keeps coming up, and by the beginning of part three, she's now, her whole life turns on solving that question. And part three is about how it's not the case that everybody's moved by self-interest, precisely because people have free will, and it takes a certain kind of thought to even formulate a self-interest, much less be motivated by it. So I give that for people who want to go back to the source and look at it. If you're trying to think about what Ayn Rand's view on this is, and to think about what your own view is, think about that and whether it's true and other people's views. Atlas Shrugged is really, a large part of it's about this issue, and I think it is rewarding to think about the book in that connection.
I find with my students, when I teach, particularly the essay on the objectivist ethics, and they will ask questions like this, such as the one you're posing. And I think it takes for me, it takes a great deal of work in terms of explaining the difference between a subjective notion of happiness and what Rand thought of as your rational happiness, as your highest moral purpose in life. So simply because someone says, shooting up with heroin or smoking a lot of dope makes me happy, you wouldn't take that sort of self-reportage at face value. You would say to that person, no, actually, it's a false sense of happiness that you're holding. But then you would have to explain a long chain of causal connections between self-preservation that's rationally pursued versus indulging in certain activities, and we can even call them certain goals that are qualitatively bad. They're inimical to your self-interest. So this, in some sense, involves, I think, proving to people that it is not just desires or whims or unreflective activities that constitute their goals that are sufficient conditions for counting as something like, this is in my self-interest. It can actually be that you are pursuing something that you haven't appraised it, you haven't evaluated, you haven't come to a proper conclusion or judgment, and you're actually pursuing something that is acting against your self-interest, your rational self-interest, that is.
Okay. Hi. So a criticism I've heard of Ayn Rand before was that she's misogynistic. Now that makes absolutely no sense to me. So why would someone have that accusation of her?
Well, it's somewhat a better question for whoever made the accusation than for us. Does anyone want to venture a guess?
I mean, I guess that viewpoint comes from, because I do work around a lot of academic feminists who actually say that Ayn Rand is misogynistic based on two fundamental claims that Rand made. One is on her essay that was posthumously published in The Voice of Reason, but I think it's in the Objectivist magazine, called The Question of a Woman as President. And and then she appeared subsequently on Donahue and said she wouldn't vote for such a woman. And talks that she gave, her last talk, I think The Sanction of the Victims, where she said to a questioner, I am a male chauvinist proudly, in response to whether the ERA should have been put forward. But I think the real reason that Rand, in my understanding at least, that Rand gets claimed to be a misogynist is because she claimed to be a man worshiper. And I don't think she literally meant M-A-N, I think she meant male in some people's minds. And she was a man worshiper. And her definition of femininity was the desire to look up to a man. to a strong man, a heroic man. But I always point people back to the source. I said, look at Dagny Taggart, look at Dominique Franklin, look at all the heroines in Rand's novels. If you think that these are women that she's putting down, or that she is, in some sense, making into meek, humble, failed creatures, then your reading is wrong. And then they press on, and I say, look, one has to somehow distinguish between maybe personal opinions that Rand might have had, but are not part of the corpus of objectivism. So I don't know that, and Onkar might be better at answering this question. I don't know, to the best of my knowledge, that a woman as president would be something completely inimical to objectivism. It might be against Rand's personal temperament and her likings, but I think those are some of the reasons that I've come across.
Do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, I want to say something on the general issue of which that's one specific of Rand's view of as a woman. Would a woman want to be president? She has a lot of views that are not part of the philosophy. A philosophy is a system of ideas that is answering certain fundamental questions about the nature of the world and of a human being and how a human being should live and guide himself in the world. And anyone, including a philosopher, has all kinds of views about other issues that philosophy doesn't encompass. It helps guide you through all of life, but it's not synonymous with all knowledge. So she has views about psychology. She has views about art, for instance. So people will bring up she didn't like Beethoven. Well, so is it part of objectivism that you're not supposed to like? And no, it's not that. Some of the standards that go into her evaluation of Beethoven, but I think she viewed him as a great artist aesthetically. She didn't respond to him personally and for certain reasons. That personal response is not part of the philosophy. And I think this issue about her views about a woman president or not, some of the issues, some of what goes into forming her view, I think are part of the philosophy. But that is not, you don't go around with different philosophies and ask, like, what's your view about a woman? It's not a philosophical issue in that sense. And one should not equate Rand's views on every particular with that's part of objectivism.
One other thing to add to that is Rand was a novelist. And to be a novelist, you have to draw whole characters, the whole of their life and all the different elements of their psychology. So a lot of her psychological views and her personal preferences, both of which things go beyond the scope of philosophy, are very important to her, as they are to everybody, but very important to her work, particularly that aspect of her work which was her main thing in life, which was writing novels. And so this is a big part of her characterizations in Atlas Shrugged, this view of man worship and so forth, of the particular man worship in the feminine sense of worshiping a male. And so I think one does need to draw that separation between philosophy and psychology and personal views, and to see them, not to put one of those aside for Rand or any other thinker, but to notice that they're separate. And then I think it's worth thinking about whether the views other than the philosophy as well, taking them seriously. If you respect an author, if you find the characters that she draws, like Dagny Taggart and Dominique, compelling, and I certainly do, to think about the views that go into them. And why is it that she thinks of women this way? And why is it that in certain contexts she described herself as a male chauvinist and said some other thing? And I don't want to, you'd have to have a whole talk on her view of gender, and I don't want to do that, and I'm not really in a position to now. I haven't given enough thought to it. But if you look at, she was responding to certain things in the women's lib movement that she thought were really terrible, including the Equal Rights Amendment, but not only that. And she was including some of the aesthetics of the movement. And so that's part of the context for some of the more provocative statements she might have made. And then there's also, most of us are only acquainted with two views of gender relations. A kind of view that's popular now in academic circles, and the kind of vestiges of a 1940s or 1950s view of the gender roles. And I don't think there's any reason to think that one of those two views has to be the right view of gender roles. I don't have a view of gender roles perfectly worked out, but there's much more, space for the right answer to be in than those things. And it's worth looking at different authors who have different positions and thinking about what's appealing and what seems true and why would it seem true and what is true about different ways of characterizing masculine and feminine psychology, and then also including also homosexual psychology of different types of, and then in different cultures where sexuality is understood very differently, and then thinking about where one comes out if one puts all that together. And I haven't done that work, so I don't really have a position on it.
Thank you.